February of 2004. The town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, is preparing to blow up the wall that built it. For almost a century and a half, a dam has stood at the fall line of the Rappahannock River, where the water drops down out of the Piedmont and runs east toward the Chesapeake Bay. The dam was there before electricity. It was there before the Civil War cannon fire that scarred these same banks. It is sewn into the city's foundation, named after one of its old judges, and most of the people pressing against the riverbank that morning have known the still water above it their whole lives. Some of them are afraid, not of the explosives, of the opposite. They believe the river behind the wall is the wall. They believe that when the charges fire, the water itself will simply drain away. What is about to happen on the Rappahannock is the exact reverse of everything they have been raised to fear. Fredericksburg, 1853. 8 years before the Civil War would split the country in two, a private water company drove timber across the fall line of the Rappahannock to turn a string of mill wheels. The men who built that first wooden dam were not thinking about fish. They were thinking about flour, lumber, and the money a falling river could make. The wall they raised would stand, in one form or another, for the next 151 years. The river they were starting to tame had been running wild for more than 10,000. The Rappahannock begins as a spring near the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains and runs roughly 195 miles east to the Chesapeake. Its name comes from an Algonquian word meaning where the tide ebbs and flows. Long before the mills, the Rappahannock people lived along its banks and pulled their living from its water. Upriver, in the foothills, the Manahoac fished and hunted across the watershed. Spring after spring, for thousands of years, the river ran loud with one of the great fish migrations of the Atlantic seaboard. American shad pushed up out of the Chesapeake by the millions. Blueback herring, alewife, hickory shad, striped bass. And in the opposite direction, in late summer, American eels came sliding down out of the mountain streams, heading for the Sargasso Sea to spawn. The Rappahannock fed everyone who stood on it. By 1910, the wooden dam had been replaced by something far more permanent, a 770-foot wall of reinforced concrete buttresses, 22 feet high, built by the Fredericksburg Water Power Company. It was named after Judge Alvin T. Embrey, a prominent local figure of the time. It powered hydroelectric turbines until the early 1960s, when Virginia Electric and Power Company simply walked away from it. The dam stayed. A few hundred yards from the wall, the ground still held the bones of Union soldiers who passed crossing the Rappahannock on pontoon bridges under Confederate fire in December of 1862. The battlefield became a national park. The dam was not part of it. It was just a thing in the water that nobody quite knew what to do with. What a dam actually does to a river is easy to underestimate. It is not just a wall. Behind it, the current slows to a crawl. The water warms in the summer sun and loses the oxygen that cold, tumbling rapids naturally carry. Sediment that a free river would flush downstream instead settles and stacks up, year after year, burying the clean gravel beds where fish lay their eggs. And the wall itself becomes a locked gate. Fish that evolved over millions of years to swim upstream to spawn simply cannot pass it. So the river above each dam falls silent, cut off from the life below. For the Rappahannock, the gate stayed shut for 151 years. 40 generations of American shad lived and died downstream of Embrey Dam without ever reaching the spawning gravel their ancestors had used for 10,000 springs. If you're enjoying this history, drop a like and subscribe to help out the channel. Thanks a lot. By the late 20th century, the Upper Rappahannock and the Rapidan, and a web of small mountain streams reaching all the way into Shenandoah National Park, sat almost entirely empty of migratory fish. The shad were gone. The herring were gone. The striped bass that had once spawned in the river's headwaters now hit the wall at Fredericksburg and stopped. American eels, which had spent 10,000 years climbing up out of the Atlantic into the Blue Ridge headwaters, could no longer get there. A river that should have been thick with life for half its length had been quietly turned into something almost no one alive could remember it not being. But the silenced fish were not even the most dangerous thing the dam was holding back. Above Fredericksburg, in the rolling hills of Virginia's Piedmont, sat the long-abandoned tailings of a 19th century gold mining belt. Mercury had been used to separate the ore. When biologists began testing the sediment trapped behind Embrey Dam in the late 1990s, what they found in the mud was not just silt. It was a century and a half of accumulated contaminants held in place by the wall itself. Here is the cruel irony at the heart of this story. The same wall that had killed the river was also the only thing keeping that poison still. To save the Rappahannock, someone was going to have to take down a dam they could not safely take down. The man who said it out loud was John Tippit. Tippit was the executive director of Friends of the Rappahannock, a small watershed nonprofit that had spent most of the 1990s trying to convince anyone with the power to listen that Embrey Dam needed to come down. The reaction, mostly, was that he was wasting his time. Then, in the late 1990s, Tippit managed to invite the senior United States Senator from Virginia onto a fishing boat below the dam. The senator was John Warner, Republican, senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, an avid angler. By the end of the afternoon, according to people who were there, Warner stood on the bank, looked at the wall, and made a promise. "I'm going to take that dam on as a personal project." It was the moment the entire fight turned. The numbers were not small. Removing Embrey, including dredging the contaminated sediment behind it, would cost roughly $10 million. The city of Fredericksburg could not pay it. Warner, working through the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, inserted the entire sum into the Water Resources Development Act and waived the customary non-federal cost share. Fredericksburg would pay nothing. The state would pay nothing. The federal government would pay all of it in exchange for the right to use the demolition itself as a military training exercise. Behind Warner stood a coalition that had taken more than a decade to build. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers oversaw the project. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ran the sediment testing. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, the city of Fredericksburg, and Friends of the Rappahannock all signed on. Engineers first dredged about 250,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment from behind the wall, roughly 50,000 dump trucks worth, and hauled it to a local composting facility. Only then could the explosives come in. The demolition itself was handed to a unit most Americans have never heard of, the 544th Engineer Dive Detachment, based at Fort Eustis on the Virginia Peninsula. Army combat divers do not exist in the public imagination the way Navy SEALs do. They do not kick in doors or run nighttime raids. What they do is harder to put in a movie. They build and repair port infrastructure under hostile fire. They cut steel and concrete underwater in zero visibility. And under the Department of Defense's Innovative Readiness Training Program, they go where the country sends them to train on real-world projects. The 544th was joined by demolition experts from the U.S. Air Force Reserves. The plan was to remove 10 of Embrey's concrete buttresses, a 130-foot section of the wall, in a single coordinated blast. The Rappahannock in February runs around 40 degrees. The divers worked in chest-deep, near-freezing water, swinging a 60-pound jackhammer against the dam's base hour after hour, day after day. They drilled all 250 holes by hand. They packed each one with C4 plastic explosive. They wired everything into a single firing circuit. Captain Clayton Lull, the company commander, named the operation Noah Shiva, after the biblical figure who survived the flood and the Hindu god of destruction and rebirth. On February 23, 2004, a crowd of more than 3,000 people gathered along the riverbank. Senator Warner, wearing the floppy-brimmed fishing hat he had bought for the occasion, stepped onto the demolition platform. A Thomas Embrey III, the grandson of the man the dam was named after, stood beside him and told the crowd he believed his grandfather, all things considered, would have understood. The countdown began. Warner pushed the plunger. A puff of smoke, a muffled crack, nothing else. Only one of the 10 clusters had fired. 225 live charges were still wired into the wall, and the failure was somewhere in the detonation circuit. The 544th had less than an hour to find it in front of a national audience. They found it. At roughly 1:15 in the afternoon, they triggered the second blast. A 130-foot section of Embrey Dam, more than 1,000 tons of reinforced concrete that had stood for 94 years, was simply gone. If you are finding this story as remarkable as I do, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into America's wildest recoveries every week, the places and the species that came back when everyone had already written them off. The next stretch of the Rappahannock story is the one nobody saw coming. The Rappahannock had not run free since 1853, 151 years. The first American shad arrived almost immediately. Within weeks of the breach, biologists were standing in the current with their nets and pulling up fish that had not spawned above Fredericksburg in 5 human generations. The 22-foot drop, where the wall had stood, became a natural set of rapids, and within a few years, it ranked as one of the best whitewater paddling stretches on the East Coast. The numbers were bigger than anyone had predicted. The blast opened 71 miles of main stem Rappahannock to spawning fish, another 35 miles of the Rappahannock River, and counting the smaller tributaries reaching up into the Blue Ridge, as much as 900 miles of newly accessible spawning habitat. Combined, that made the Rappahannock the only free-flowing river from the Chesapeake Bay all the way to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Army Corps came back in 2005 to finish the demolition. By 2006, every visible piece of Embrey was gone. The shad came back. The blueback herring came back. The hickory shad came back. The striped bass came back. And then, in the small headwater streams 60 miles inland, the scientists started getting reports of something stranger. Eels. The American eel is one of the strangest fish in North America. It spawns in the Sargasso Sea, drifts as a leaf-shaped larva on the Gulf Stream, slips into Atlantic estuaries as a transparent glass eel, and then climbs, sometimes literally, up wet rocks and through damp grass, into the headwaters of mountain streams. It lives there for 10 to 30 years, then swims back to the ocean to spawn and die. Embrey had cut the eel's return route to the Blue Ridge for nearly 6 generations. 8 years after the wall came down, biologists surveying small streams inside Shenandoah National Park, 60 miles upstream of the old dam line, found breeding American eels, not just present, reproducing. The river had unlocked its own headwaters. The Embrey breach did not stay a local story for long. The Chesapeake 2000 agreement, signed by the federal government and 4 states, had set a target of opening 1,357 miles of new fish passage across the entire Chesapeake watershed. Embrey alone contributed close to 700. American Rivers, the National Dam Removal Advocacy Group, started pointing to it as a regional model. The Patapsco River's Blood Dam came out in Maryland in 2018. The Penobscot River in Maine reopened. The Klamath River in California saw 4 dams fall. There are still more than 2,500 dams standing in the Chesapeake watershed. Most of them are older than living memory. Almost all of them are obsolete. None of this means tearing out a dam is free of consequences, and the scientists never pretended it was. River restoration is not a switch you flip. It is a trade. The sediment plume Embrey released took years to fully settle, and the Army Corps had to return more than once to dredge what was left. What the people who studied the Rappahannock most carefully decided, again and again, was that a living river was worth far more than a still one. Today, the only thing left where Embrey Dam stood is a commemorative plaque on the riverbank. Senator John Warner died in 2021. John Tippett still works on the river. The Rappahannock people, federally recognized in 2018 after more than 400 years of waiting, hold ceremonies along the same banks where their ancestors pulled shad from the spring tide. The river is moving again. The fish, which know nothing of senators or ceremonies, did not wait to be invited home. If you want to see another American comeback nobody believed was possible, the video on screen is waiting for you. Subscribe and stay with us, and we will keep finding the wild places that refuse to stay dead.